Madam Deputy Speaker, it is a privilege to rise and contribute to the debate, and I want to endorse the comments made by my colleagues who have spoken before me, and I want to acknowledge Vietnam Veterans Day. It is a war that has relevance in terms of my own life experiences because I am of that vintage where as young men and women we grew up at a time when Australia was committing to the Vietnam War and to the conflict that occurred there. And we know that some of the events that occurred over a period of time and the footage that we saw in reality on television for the first time in a way that we hadn't covered the conflict from its beginning to its end. And we had a sense of some of the challenges that our Australian servicemen and women experienced from those visual images. Over 60,000 Australians served in the Vietnam conflict, and sadly 521 paid the ultimate sacrifice for their country and its interests. Some 47,000 Vietnam veterans are alive today, and it is for them, their fallen comrades, and the families affected that we remember them specifically every year. There are many Vietnam veterans in Hasluck, and I often believe that as members of Parliament we have an incredible privilege in meeting and working and talking with servicemen and women who've served in many fronts and many campaigns on behalf of this country. Servicemen and women, when called, don't ask, they serve. And I've had the privilege and honour to meet with some of these men in my first year in office. The pride with which they acknowledge their service, the regret they express at the loss of life, and the frustration of their treatment on returning home from Vietnam makes me truly humble. And certainly the pictorial representation that was so strong those days have left etched in my memory the way in which we treated some of our servicemen returning back from that conflict. Vietnam Veterans Day is an important occasion, but one made even more poignant this year on the 45th anniversary of the Battle of Long Tan. In 1966, 18 young Australians died and 24 were wounded in what would become the stuff of legend. I remember the headlines in the local papers that were common in Perth at that time, but in particular a cartoon that was drawn, and I'm sure it was by Paul Rigby, that showed Aussie diggers surrounded and at the end of a campaign just leaning there quietly reflecting on the fact that they had lost fallen comrades, but also looking at the insurmountable numbers that had charged during that campaign. Keen to inflict a politically unacceptable number of casualty on Australian forces, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong planned an ambush of the Australian troops in the rubber plantation area of Long Tan. I will not repeat the details of this well-known battle here today, but the men of D Company, 6th Royal Australian Regiment, the 1st APC Squadron and a section of the New Zealand Artillery defeated a numerically superior force numbering in the thousands. In the pursuing battle over 24 hours, Australian courage and fighting spirit was shown to the world. Most of these men were not regular soldiers. Many of us of a certain age will remember the controversy surrounding conscription and the drafting of Australia's young men into the armed forces. At Long Tan, conscripts faced off against some of North Vietnam's toughest soldiers and held themselves and their country in high regard. As a result, a long overdue unit citation of gallantry was awarded to D Company of 6 RAR last week. I honour their courage and am pleased that this nation finally recognises the true sacrifice our armed forces made in this decade-long conflict, which shaped the 60s and the 70s. I have friends that served in the Vietnam War, and each one has a different story to tell of their service. Some received devastating physical wounds, but all of them were wounded emotionally and mentally and in some capacity. It has taken Australian society a long time to understand and acknowledge issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder and the impact that this has on returning soldiers and their families. I would like to think that we have learnt these lessons and are prepared for our troops returning home from Iraq and Afghanistan, but more needs to be done. This was shown at a recent forum I held with the Shadow Minister for Veteran Affairs, Senator Michael Ronaldson. Veterans from the conflicts of World War II, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Iraq and Afghanistan came together to talk about their issues. The recurring theme was one of helplessness that our Vietnam veterans felt on return, especially for those who were physically incapacitated as a result of their service and the impact that has had on the quality of life. It was very interesting listening to the stories that they shared with us of both their pride of having served their country, but then the frustration they have in what they termed a continuing war, to retain a recognition for the rights and entitlements that they were seeking for both the physical, the emotional and mental impact that that war had. And certainly their shared stories brought back to me memories of three people in particular: Peter Keelaw, who comes from the town of Corrigan, who served, and the two brothers, Peter and David Stone, who were twins that served in Vietnam. All three, as I remember them, went away as strong young men. When they returned, Peter came back having stood on a mine and lost his limbs. David and Peter, who shared some of their story but never shared the detail, but certainly indicated their pride in having served. I would like to thank Senator Michael Ronaldson and the Shadow Minister for Defence, Senator David Johnson, for making it such an informative day for those who attended, but equally those veterans who were in attendance. I'm sure that we are all proud that these men, because they as servicemen and women, fought to ensure that the freedoms we have and we will always enjoy are endured long into the future. I am equally as proud of the returned service leagues that call Hasluck home. The Gosnells RSL is a very vibrant group of returned servicemen. The Bellevue RSL and the Kalamunda RSL all represent their members well, and I enjoy the camaraderie of the discussions that I have with them on the issues that they raise. Issues about ex-Vietnamese servicemen now dominate their agenda, and that the Coalition continues to work hard to shape appropriate policy in this area. Earlier this year, I held a saluting their service ceremony in my electoral office. I was fortunate enough to be able to present several Vietnam War veterans with a certificate acknowledging their efforts in this brutal conflict. What was really warming, and it touched me and touched my staff, was that just sitting there and listening to them as veterans swap their stories, their experiences, about the challenges that they still grapple with, but the fact that they were sitting at the table and had the capacity and ability to be able to contribute to that discussion. Men of all different ages, from different conflicts, with different experiences, but the one thing that they all were, from their perspective, Australians who served their country. Once again, Deputy Speaker, I want to acknowledge the 60,000 service personnel who served in Vietnam and sacrificed so much in the name of this great country. Our armed forces do not choose where they fight, but they fight when called upon, and they must always be honoured and respected. It is the foundation upon which this nation was built, and I want to acknowledge their contribution and ask that we never forget what they have given us. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Order.